Shattered illusions, I never thought a single moment could break me. But that night, as I stepped into the dimly lit restaurant, my world collapsed in an instant. There she was, my daughter, laughing, leaning too close, her fingers grazing his hand. A man I had never seen before. My blood turned to ice. My breath caught in my throat. The weight of betrayal hit me like a tidal wave. She was my little girl, my pride, my reason to believe in love and family. And yet, here she sat, sharing an intimacy with a stranger that I never imagined witnessing, that I wanted to turn away, pretend I hadn't seen it. But my feet remained glued to the floor. My mind raced. Who was he? How long had this been happening? Had I failed her? Or had she simply drifted away without me noticing? Memories flooded my mind. The times I held her hand when she was scared. The nights I stayed up, soothing her nightmares. The mornings I packed her lunch with little notes, reminding her she was loved. And now, here she was, grown, making choices I never saw coming. Choices that burned through my soul, that I clenched my fists, fighting the storm of emotions within me. Anger, disbelief, heartbreak. Was she ashamed? Did she know I was watching? Or worse, did she not care? The man whispered something, and she laughed again, oblivious to the devastation unraveling inside me. My heart pounded like a war drum, echoing in my ears. I had two choices: confront her and demand answers, or walk away and let this moment haunt me forever. I took a deep breath, steadying myself. The restaurant's warm lighting and soft chatter felt like cruel mockery against my turmoil. I watched as she sipped her drink, her eyes twinkling, lost in a world I wasn't a part of anymore. When had she become so distant? When had she stopped needing me? A father's love is supposed to be unwavering, protective, and unconditional. But at that moment, I questioned everything. Was I being too harsh? Was I reading too much into this? Maybe he was just a friend. Maybe I had nothing to worry about. But the way she looked at him, the warmth in her gaze, the soft smile playing on her lips, told me otherwise. That I felt like an intruder in her life, a ghost watching from the shadows. My mind flashed back to when she was a child, her tiny hand wrapped around my finger, her eyes filled with trust and innocence. I remembered the bedtime stories, the scraped knees I had kissed better, the whispered promises that I would always be there for her. And yet, here she was, living a life I knew nothing about. I stepped closer, still unnoticed. My chest ached with the weight of realization. She wasn't my little girl anymore. She was a woman with her own secrets, her own desires, her own choices. And maybe, just maybe, it was time I accepted that. But accepting it didn't make it hurt any less. The man reached for her hand, and she let him, her fingers lacing through his effortlessly. My stomach twisted. A part of me wanted to pull her away, demand an explanation, remind her of the love and guidance I had given her all these years. But another part, the one burdened by the harsh truth of time, knew that I had to let her go. That I turned away, my heart heavy, my soul fractured. Love isn't about control. It's about trust, about hoping that all the lessons you taught them will guide them, even when you're no longer the center of their world. And as I walked out of the restaurant, leaving a piece of myself behind, I whispered a silent prayer, hoping she would always find happiness, even if it wasn't in the way I had imagined. Outside, the cold night air hit me like a slap. I stood on the sidewalk, my hands trembling, staring at the reflections in the restaurant window. She looked happy. It was a smile I hadn't seen in years, genuine and unburdened. When had she stopped smiling like that around me? I closed my eyes, exhaling slowly. My heart ached, but it wasn't just pain, it was realization. My daughter had grown up. She had built a life beyond the walls of our home, beyond the childhood I had so carefully nurtured. And that was how it was supposed to be, wasn't it? But why did it feel like a betrayal? A part of me wanted to step back inside, to sit her down and ask, no, beg, her to tell me everything, to make me a part of her world again. But another part, the part that knew she was no longer a child, understood that this was the way of things. Parents raise their children to be independent. Yet when they finally are, it feels like a knife to the heart. I turned away from the restaurant, stuffing my hands in my pockets, and began to walk. The city was alive around me, people laughing, cars honking, life moving on as if my world hadn't just shattered. I wandered aimlessly, lost in thought, until I found myself standing in front of Small Park, a place I had taken her many times when she was little. I sat on a worn wooden bench, my breath visible in the crisp night air. I could still see her, a tiny bundle of energy running across the playground, calling for me to watch her, to catch her, to hold her when she fell. And I always did. I was always there. But tonight I wasn't. Tonight, she was in there with someone else, sharing her laughter, her secrets, her dreams. And I was out here, a spectator in her life. That I pulled out my phone, my fingers hovering over her name. I could call her. I could demand an explanation. But what would that accomplish? Would it change anything? Or would it only push her further away? Instead, I sat there, staring at her name on the screen, remembering the days when she would call me for everything. When she would run to me, arms wide open, trusting that I would catch her. When she still needed me. Maybe she still did, just in a different way. Maybe she didn't need me to protect her anymore, but to trust her, to support her from a distance, to believe that she could make her own choices, even if they terrified me. That a tear slipped down my cheek, quickly wiped away by the night breeze. I had spent years preparing her for the world, but I had never prepared myself for the day she wouldn't need me to hold her hand. That I put my phone back in my pocket, took a deep breath, and stood up. Maybe it was time to stop seeing this as a loss. Maybe it was time to see it for what it truly was. The days that followed were heavy with silence. I went through the motions of life, but a storm raged inside me. My mind replayed that night at the restaurant over and over again. I told myself to move on, to accept that my daughter had grown, but the image of her laughing with that man haunted me like a ghost I couldn't shake. For years, I had been her anchor, her safe place, the one she turned to when life was too much. But now I was just a shadow on the outskirts of her world. Had I pushed her away? Had I failed in ways I hadn't noticed? The thought gnawed at me until I couldn't take it anymore. I needed to see her, to talk to her, not as an angry father demanding explanations, but as a man trying to understand his own daughter. That evening, I drove to her apartment. My heart pounded as I knocked on the door. Seconds stretched into eternity before she answered. When she saw me standing there, surprise flickered across her face, but she quickly masked it with a polite smile. "Dad, this is unexpected. Come in." Her living room was warm and inviting, but I barely noticed. My eyes searched hers, trying to read the thoughts she wasn't saying out loud. "I wanted to see you," I admitted. "It's been a while." She nodded, offering me tea, which I barely sipped. An awkward silence settled between us, a stark contrast to the easy conversations we once had. I finally mustered the courage to say what had been weighing on my heart. "I saw you at the restaurant the other night." With him. Her expression stiffened, and she set her cup down carefully. "Dad, I know. Let me finish," I interrupted gently. "I'm not here to judge or tell you what to do. I realize that I don't know you anymore, and that terrifies me." She looked down at her hands, and for a moment, I thought she wouldn't answer. But then, she sighed and met my gaze, her eyes softer than I had expected. "Dad, I never meant to shut you out. I love you, but I've grown up, and I needed to figure out who I'm outside of being your daughter. That man you saw, his name is Adam. He's important to me. I wanted to tell you, but I was afraid you wouldn't approve." Her words hit me harder than I anticipated. Had I really made her feel like she had to hide her happiness from me? "Sweetheart, I may not always understand your choices, but I never want you to feel like you can't come to me. No matter what, I will always be your father." Tears welled in her eyes, and for the first time in years, she reached for my hand, just like she did when she was a child. "I know, Dad, and I'm sorry for keeping this from you. I just didn't want to disappoint you." I squeezed her hand, my heart aching with love and regret. "You could never disappoint me. I just want you to be happy. That's all I've ever wanted." For the first time since that fateful night, a weight lifted off my chest. Maybe I was losing the little girl who once clung to my hand, but I was gaining something just as precious, a daughter who was strong, independent, and still in her own way, minded. As we sat there, talking long into the night, I realized that love wasn't about holding on too tight. It was about trusting, about letting go just enough to let them fly, knowing that no matter how far they go, they will always find their way back home.